Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. I'll keep my intro very short today, as many of you joined us last week for our first session with Dr. Simkovich. If you missed last week and you haven't had a chance to watch the recording, it's available on our website. And assuming all of our technology works correctly today, this session will also be online soon. A couple of logistical notes. As usual, please enter your questions using the Q&A button. And also the source sheet was included in reminder emails. We'll also be posting it to the chat here momentarily. And with that, I would like to welcome back Dr. Malka Simkovich, who is the Crown Ryan Chair of Jewish Studies and Director of Catholic Jewish Studies Program at Catholic Theological Union. Welcome, Dr. Simkovich. We're excited to learn with you again today. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Matt, and thank you to Becky and everyone at the Haberman Institute. Thank you to today's sponsors, and thanks, as always, to those of you who are taking time from your day, from your lunch hour maybe, to join us on today's call, which is the second class in a two-part series on the Apocrypha and the world of Second Temple Judaism. If you were able to join us last week or you accessed the video online, you know that in our first class, we talked about various versions of the Hasmonean victory, and we compared 1 Maccabees with 2 Maccabees, 1 Maccabees being a book that was written by an insider of the Hasmonean court. It is maybe not objective, but it is a straightforward account of the Hasmonean rebellion with a focus on those heroes, whereas 2 Maccabees is a work of theology. It's produced in the diaspora. It was a 5-volume work, now lost to us, produced in beautiful Greek, and one of the most anti-Hellenist Jewish documents that has come down to us from this period. And the reason why I compared these two talks is because I think it's a good example of how various debates were live and open-ended in the Second Temple period. And so we compared how 1 Maccabees is anti-martyrdom, 2 Maccabees celebrates martyrdom. And this kind of open-endedness sort of generates incredible creativity and playfulness. And today we're going to build on those themes. I'm going to do so by talking about another area in which Jews, wherever they lived in the land of Israel or in the diaspora, were debating questions regarding how to interpret their history and their scriptural tradition. And I'm going to take you back now, not to the Hasmonean period, but to the much earlier world of the First Temple. I'm looking for my Tanakh, which is somewhere on my very messy desk. But those of you who are familiar with the Hebrew Bible and specifically with biblical prophetic literature are well aware that the biblical prophets, and especially the prophets who were writing material in the late First Temple period, very often compare the polity of Israel to a woman. And the female experience is often seen as an experience of vulnerability, of dependence. We're talking about an environment that was obviously very patriarchal. And so it worked. This image of Israel as a woman, as a daughter, as a wife, highlighted the vulnerability, the physical weakness of the people of Israel, and their dependency, relationality, when it came to the covenantal relationship with God. And so the Jewish people are often depicted as a woman, a daughter, a wife. By the way, God is also depicted in female terms. I've written about that. If you're curious, you can email me and I'll send you some articles. God is sometimes depicted, as we know, as a husband, a spouse, a father, but also depicted in maternal terms as well. And so we have these paradigms that the biblical authors use. But if you think about these paradigms, sometimes they are not very warm and fuzzy. When we think about how or sort of what objectives does it serve for the biblical authors to talk about Israel as a woman, it might not make us feel very good. When we take the metaphor to its extreme, the woman / Israel is often an adulteress, disloyal, deserving of rejection. And so to our modern sensibilities, this can make us very, very uncomfortable. And it also made Jews in the Second Temple period very uncomfortable. One of the fascinating features of Second Temple literature produced in the second and first centuries BCE is that they borrow from these images of Israel embodying the female experience, but they reframe them as an experience or a set of experiences that is ultimately very positive. And so what you have beginning in the second century BCE is Jewish novellas and stories and tales produced both orally and also through the written word that feature heroines who, in whatever way, embody the experience of the people of Israel, so that you might not think, whether it's Judith or Esther, or look at some others that you might not have heard of, Asenath, the wife of Joseph, Susanna, you might not think that these women can overcome their trials and tribulations. They aren't, they're physically weaker, or they're maybe confined to more domestic sphere, but despite their trials and tribulations, they overcome. In some cases, they even save the people of Israel. We're going to look at some of these stories today and think about why it was particularly that these stories about Jewish triumph and unexpected salvation feature women at the heart at the heart of these novellas. And I want to begin with a little bit of history. Last week, you received a source sheet that has a timeline. I'm going to share this week's source sheet as well. And it begins with a timeline, but it's not the same timeline. I've added a few things. Now, I should say that you are very welcome to add questions or comments to the Q&A, but I'm not going to start checking the Q&A until the last, let's say, half hour of this class. So feel free to put your questions and comments. And if it's a question, if it's a matter of clarification, I can, I'll be looking at it here and there, but I'm not going to address most of your questions until the end of the hour. Oh, except someone says, would I please close the drapes to cut down the glare? Well, I suppose I can do that. Sure, why not? Hold on 1 second. All right. I don't know. Is that more helpful? Anonymous, private chatter? I don't know. We're going to keep going. So I'm going to share my screen and you're going to see a timeline. Now, again, this timeline is not identical to the one that I shared last week because I've inserted some details that I think are pertinent to the subject of novellas that feature women. What do you see? A little bit larger and a little bit different font that I've added to last week's timeline. There are women's names. These are women who took front and center stage in political, social, even religious, maybe, roles, particularly in Judea. And so I don't think that it's a coincidence that as Jews are producing novellas that feature women, again, Judith, the Greek version of Esther, Susanna, Joseph and Asenath, which I'm sure most of you have not heard of, but it's a very important work. I think that there is a correlation. I'm not the only person to say this. Is a correlation between this prolific sort of genre of stories about women and the fact that we start to see women taking on very public leadership roles, particularly in the Hasmonean family. Just looking at the question. Okay, well, my anonymous attendee said much better, thanks. Okay, good. So now there's no glare maybe. All right, so I'm going to mention a little bit of history, and particularly I want to home in on one figure, and that's Salome Alexandra. You might know her as Shlom Tzion Hamalka, and she was a queen towards the end of the Hasmonean era. I also want to point you to Berenike, who was part of the Hasmonean Herodian dynasty in the early 1st century. She appears in the book of Acts and New Testament. Helena of Adiabene, who was a very famous Persian queen, who, according to rabbinic sources, converted to Judaism. But I want to focus on Salome Alexandra, say a few words about her, and then we'll look at the literature. I'm going to stop my share because it might be boring just to be staring at this timeline, and you should have it accessible from an earlier email. All right. Salome Alexandra was enormously popular in the rabbinic imagination. And the reason is because as Judea became increasingly a site of, I would say, a political factionalism, we might say sectarianism, the proto-rabbinic community, better known as the Pharisees, are supported by Salome Alexandra in a way that was unprecedented under the Hasmonean leadership. So only 2 generations after the Hasmonean rebellions, Hasmonean leaders begin to assimilate into Hellenistic society. And very infamously, the husband of Salome Alexandra, again, she's also known as Shalom Zion, her husband, Alexander Yanai, becomes a real pro-assimilationist and persecutes the Pharisees. Josephus talks about how he crucified 800 Pharisees and killed their wives and children. When Alexander Yanai dies, his wife Salome Alexandra becomes the queen of Judea, and she leaves a mixed legacy. On the one hand, she reconciles with the Pharisaic community. She provides them the support that they need, not only to disseminate their own traditions and to develop them, but also to become very significant social and political leaders in Judea. But she's also viewed on the international scale as a profound failure. By this, I mean that she does not successfully choose among her 2 sons a successor. So she has 2 sons, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. In the 60s, hold on, I have to go back up. In the 60s BCE, and Hyrcanus and Aristobulus both want to take over for Salome Alexandra. Hyrcanus is a pro-Pharisee. Aristobulus is more like his father. He wants to assimilate into the Hellenistic world, and they're fighting with each other. What happens is that their conflict generates a civil war. Both of the brothers, after Salome's death, appeal to Rome, and Rome says, well, there's this internal dispute in Judea among these 2 brothers. This is a great opportunity for us to capitalize on the local weakness of the Judeans and essentially invade Jerusalem and occupy it. This is the beginning of the Roman occupation of Judea. And so her legacy is very mixed. On the one hand, because she doesn't leave a clear successor and she can't bring herself to choose a son, Josephus and others blame her for the ultimate Roman occupation of Judea that leads to the fall of the temple. But in the rabbinic imagination, because she reconciles with religious leaders such as the Pharisees and others, Salome is considered a very great queen. She's not the only woman, like I said, in the Hasmonean family to take a public role. Now, the novellas that are being produced, which feature women, precede the reign of Salome Alexandra and later Berenike and Helena and others. So I'm not arguing that the novellas that we're going to look at were produced as a result of being exposed to these female leaders. But I do think that after the Judeans and Jews outside of Judea start to be exposed to female leadership, these novellas become very, very popular and also more easily applied to their own political realities. And so what I don't have on the timeline is that Jews, even in Egypt, supported queens. Now, they weren't Jewish queens, but there were 2 different Cleopatras, one at the end of the 2nd century BC, one at the end of the 1st century BCE, that the Jews of Egypt supported, even though these Cleopatras, these queens, did not have the majority support of Egyptian Greeks. And so the Jews were accustomed to female leadership, and perhaps that was informed by the fact that they had literature featuring women leaders, but also as a result of this historical reality, I think that these novellas become perhaps even more mainstream. But all of that is to say that the novellas that are produced should be, I think, read within a tradition that really derives from the biblical prophetic writings. So when we look at Judith and when we look at the Greek version of Esther, let's think about the biblical passages and stories upon which they are based. So for Judith, that will be the book of Judges. Judith is an amalgam of Yael and Deborah, Yael and Devorah in Judges 4 and 5. So that is a very, very influential story for the writer of Judith. And obviously the Greek version of Esther is based on the Hebrew version of Esther. but mindful of the ways in which Israel is presented as an embodied woman in the scriptures, late Second Temple Jewish writers do new things with this metaphor. In other words, in these stories, these women do embody the sort of the polity of global Jewish identity, but they are empowered. They're not adulterous wives, they're not battered daughters, they're not rejected women. If anything, it's very much the opposite. So let's start with Judith, which I think many of us are familiar with, but very few of us have actually sort of looked very deeply in textually. Judith is a story that's associated with Hanukkah and with the Hasmonean rebellion. And the book of Judith is preserved in the Apocrypha. So again, it's scriptural in the Catholic tradition, but not scriptural in the Jewish tradition. However, like 1 Maccabees and maybe 2 Maccabees, it is written by an observant Jew, by which I mean whoever wrote Judith was observant of Shabbat, dietary law, circumcision. Whoever wrote Judith knew their scriptures very well. And the author almost certainly wrote this in Judea in Hebrew. We only have Judith circulating in Greek today, although scholars have reproduced it in what they think is its original Hebrew. We can't guess, we can't presume what we have is an exact match, because again, the ancient version of Judith that was produced in Hebrew was translated early on to Greek, circulated in Greek, then transmitted through Christian scriptural traditions. And only in modern times have scholars translated Judith back into Hebrew. So why do scholars think that Judith was written in Hebrew? Because the Greek contains awkward turns of phrase and Semiticisms that look a little strange in the Greek, but when you reverse translate it back into Hebrew, you get very eloquent language. And so there is consensus that the book of Judith was produced in Hebrew by a Judean Jew sometime in the 2nd century BCE after the Hasmonean rebellion. And that detail becomes very important because I'm going to argue, I'll just give it away. I don't like surprises, so I don't leave surprises to my audiences. I'm going to argue that Judith is an alternate version or kind of satirical version of Judah Maccabee. And so when you think about Judith, first of all, her name Yehudit mirrors the name of Yehudah, and they're both also generically rendered as Jewish, Jew, but Yehudah is also a biblical name. But Yehudit has her own armor. That armor is her beauty. It is her dress. It is her jewelry. Just like Yehudah has his armor, which is actual armor. And Yehudit defeats an enemy, no thanks to the leaders of her society. She does it on her own. She is not relying on the system or on the powerful insiders, the elders of her town. The first thing that you'll notice about the book of Judith is that historically it makes no sense. And I think that this is proof, actually, that the book of Judith is modeled after Yehudah. So let's take a look at the first few verses and you'll see what I mean. Hold on. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so we're scrolling down. And by the way, so now you'll see I have reference to Shlom Tzion HaMalka. I have reference to the famous Queen Helena of Adiabini. By the way, my friend Sarit Katan Gribitz is writing a book on her. Sarit is a professor at Fordham and is an amazing scholar. And there's a lot of scholarship that will be coming out on Helena of Adiabini. And then there's Berenike. Okay, but also for your reference, if you want to learn more about these historical women, you can look up these sources on your own. The rabbis are very, very positive about Shlom Tzion HaMalka for reasons that I mentioned. Berenike, the legacy is extremely mixed, partly because she had an affair with Titus, the Roman general and emperor. And I wrote an article on the Torah.com. I think it's on the Torah.com about Berenike. You can look it up. Again, Romans hated her and the Jews were ambivalent about her, but I feel a lot of sympathy for Berenike because she was not held to the same standards as her Roman lover, Titus. Fascinating figure, and I wish we all knew more about Berenike. And then in Helena, here are the sources that you can look up about Helena, very, very beloved in Jewish tradition. Okay, so those are all historical passages. Let's look at Judith. The first thing you'll notice again is ahistoricity. There seems to be many historical errors in just the opening paragraph in Judith. And so you can read this with a hermeneutic of suspicion or a hermeneutic of grace. You can say, look, this doesn't make any sense. Maybe the author had one too many beers when he was writing the opening verses of Judith. I prefer to assume that there's intentionality here, but let's look at all the historical problems. It's 12th year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Now we know from the Bible that Nebuchadnezzar is a Babylonian king. In fact, the Babylonian king who's responsible for galvanizing and overseeing the fall of the Jerusalem temple in 586 and the exile of the Judeans. But this Nebuchadnezzar in Judith, who does he rule over? He rules over the Assyrians. Already, this is very, very strange. The Assyrian Empire and Nineveh were long gone by the time the author of Judith produced his work, but they were also kind of gone-ish, or at least not a major empire, by the time Nebuchadnezzar is ruling Babel. So here we have some strange things. Nebuchadnezzar, the ruler over the Assyrians in the great city of Nineveh, very, very strange. And in those days, there was another leader, Arphaxad, who was a leader of Medes in Ecbatana. Now, Arphaxad, you might know, but that's a Persian name. And Medes was like Parasu Madai, was a small region that was prominent during the Persian Empire. So this is very, very strange. Now, what we're going to see is that Nebuchadnezzar wages war against his enemy, King Arphaxad. And in order to win this war, Nebuchadnezzar turns to his client kingdoms, to all the small regions that he has conquered. And he says, I invite you to wage war with me against King Arphaxad. But of course, this is not a friendly invitation. This is the kind of invitation where you say, I invite you to wage war with me, or else I'm going to kill you. So the client kingdoms do not really have a choice. They have to join Nebuchadnezzar. Otherwise, Nebuchadnezzar will attack them. And we'll see that that's exactly what happens when the Judeans say, no thanks to Nebuchadnezzar. In fact, we don't feel like fighting with you against King Arphaxad. But before we get to the conflict with the Judeans, let's back this up. Again, we have a Babylonian king ruling an Assyrian empire, fighting a Persian era kingdom. And we're going to see that the number one general of Nebuchadnezzar, well, actually, I did not include it on the source sheet, but the number one general of Nebuchadnezzar, who is dispatched to punish the Judeans who refuse to fight alongside Nebuchadnezzar, his name is Holofernes. And so, again, Babylonian king, ruling the Assyrian Empire, fighting Persians, and using the greatest general in the empire, Holofernes. That's a Greek name. What in the world is going on here? None of this makes sense. I always say when I teach this text, you have to think about the most absurd historical claim you could possibly make. When Kim Kardashian, the first president of the United States, was fighting for the South in the Civil War, she had coffee with Abraham Joshua Heschel. I mean, it does not, right? Like that doesn't, that's a nonsensical sentence. Now, any Jew, although it would be kind of cool if Abraham Joshua Heschel had coffee with Kim Kardashian, I kind of want to know like what that would be like. But any Jew in the late 2nd century BCE reading this passage would know right away, this is a ahistorical document. And so what's the message? Is the author stupid? Or is there something going on here where the author is saying, I'm writing a work of satire. Here are the signals that I'm going to send my audience, so that they take the historical material and they set it to the side and they focus on the narrative elements, the theological message, the core elements of the story, which is not that this is a text that's archival. This is a text that's meant to tell you something about God's covenantal promises to the Jewish people. So it's clear satire. And I think it's very important because a lot of us who've heard of Judith, we treat this like it's primarily valuable because it happens. Personally, I don't care. And I think that we can have a longer conversation in the Q&A about how to treat ancient scriptural texts, and sort of the question of historicity and value. When it comes to Judith, there is incredible value in this document. That doesn't mean that there's historicity. And soon you will see why I do think that there's historical sensitivity here, in that Judith is modeled after Judah, and Judah was a real person. Okay, so let's go to the middle of the book. We have a crisis. The crisis is that the Judeans refuse to join Nebuchadnezzar in his battle against King Arphaxad, and Holofernes is dispatched to Judea to punish them. The focus in the story is not simply all of Judea. The focus is one little town in Judea, and that town is called Betulia. Betulia means virgin town. There is no evidence, as you can guess, of a town in early Israel called Virgin Town. We have no evidence, archaeological or literary or otherwise, that there was a town called Virgin Town, Betulia, but it's part of the satirical element of the story. And we'll see that there is a lot of, or I'll say there's different modes of humor in this story. There's farce, there's satire, and there's just, I think, just plain silliness. We're going to see some silly, lowbrow humor. And I think that the fact that we're talking about a town called Betulia, I think it's lowbrow humor. Okay, I'm seeing comments or I don't know what those are, but I'm going to check the questions a little later in the class. All right. So there's a crisis. When the people of Betulia say, we will not fight with you, Holofernes is sent to besiege the town and starve them out. Now, I skipped pretty much the entire first half of the book. But what happens in the first half of the book is that the elders of Betulia despair. They don't have a political plan. They don't have a strategy. The strategy is simply that they're going to pray to God and hope against all hopes for some kind of miraculous intervention. So this is the moment of crisis in chapter 7. The Israelites are greatly terrified. They say to one another, oh no, are they Assyrians, Babylonians, Greeks? I have no idea. The enemy will now strip clean the whole land. They're going to invade. They're going to starve us out and then attack. The elders they have no plan. They're saying, sit tight, and we're going to fast for a few days. And so, of course, this is like irony of ironies. The people are starving because they're suffering in a siege. And then the little food that they have, the elders say, don't eat that little food that you have, because maybe if you fast, God will take it as a sign of repentance. You're going to see the author of this book does not look kindly on that mode of repentance. Like the author of 1 Maccabees, the author of Judith does not believe that you should sit around and enter a state of penance and prayer and fasting. The author of Judith, just like the author of 1 Maccabees, believes that a Jew in trouble must take matters into their own hands and pick up their sword, or in Judith's case, her dresses. And so the people are listless and they're gathering around Uzziah, the ruler of the town, the elder, and they're saying, you are not helping us. You're doing us a great injury. You're not making peace with the Assyrians. We're all dying, and it would be better for us to be captured by them than to be starving ourselves hoping for a miracle. So the people are very dissatisfied with their leadership, and Uzziah is really just kind of like a stinky leader in this story. And he says, courage, my brothers and sisters, we're going to hold out 5 days more. We're going to wait for God to show his mercy upon us. And now in comes Judith in the middle of the story. By the way, structurally, this mirrors 1 Maccabees, because Judah enters the scene of 1 Maccabees in chapter 8 of 1 Maccabees, and you're really building up the narrative tension for a very, very long time in the book of Maccabees. It's the same thing with Judith. The crisis builds and it builds and it builds and it builds. Judith only enters the scene of her own story in chapter 8. This is how we're introduced to her. By the way, if you were going to be a woman in the ancient world during this period and you needed financial and physical independence, the only way to have that independence, I hate to say it this way, is to be a widow. Because if you're a daughter, you live in your father's house, and then once you marry, you transfer from your father's house, presumably your parents' house, to the house of your spouse, to your husband and his parents. But a widow, especially the wife of someone who had been very wealthy, could inherit that wealth, especially if she doesn't have children, then you have questions about who inherits. But you inherit your spouse's wealth, and you're not expected or required to go back and live with a parent. So the fact that Judith is a widow here is very significant. Her husband Menashe dies. We're told he dies in the field. I don't think that that's on the source sheet. It's right before verse 4. And he dies, and so she mourns for him. She doesn't live in her gorgeous villa when she's in mourning. She sets up a modest little tent, and that's where she lives during her period of mourning. She wears sackcloth. She fasts all the days of her widowhood, except for Shabbat and the day before Shabbat, which was kind of like a semi-holiday. She doesn't fast on the new moon or the day before the new moon or the festivals and the days before the festivals. So she's observing the calendrical practices of the Jewish people. She's very pious, but she's also in a state of mourning. She's beautiful in appearance, and no one spoke ill of her. And remember, in the Hellenistic period, there's no tension between physical beauty and religious piety. These things go together. The Greeks believed in the perfection of the body being concurrent with perfection of the soul. So there's no blonde bimbo in the ancient world. You won't find someone whose stupidity is tied to their beauty. I don't know of any example of that in Jewish literature produced at this time. Judith is beautiful, and she is brilliant, and she's strategic, and she's pragmatic, and she's pious. And so Judith is living in Betulia. Now, presumably, and we're going to see, this is actually an important detail, she has her own preserves. She has her own food. Now, we don't know why she's not sharing it with all the people, but she does something better than sharing it. She actually saves them from the enemy. So she's not starving. And again, that's going to be a very important detail. She summons Uzziah to her. She summons Uzziah and other elders of the town to her, and she berates them. She gives them a talking to. This mirrors the story of Devorah in Judges 4, and we'll see later the story of Yael in Judges 5, because that story opens with Devorah summoning the leader of the Israelites, Barak, and saying, you're not doing your job, so I guess I have to do it for you. You're not properly fighting the enemy, so I guess I have to fight for you. And what does it say about someone when that person summons another person? The fact that Judith, who's presumably on a lower social caste than Uzziah and his cronies, the fact that she summons them to her tells you about her self-understanding as a future leader of the people of Israel. And how does she summon them? She sends her maid to get them. Now, in Greek, the word is doulos, which is not maid. Maid is a sanitized translation. This would have been a slave. And slaves in the ancient world, there were all kinds of slaves. Some slaves were really limited in what they could do, but other slaves in the Hellenistic period were mobile. So when we think of a slave, of course, it's very, we have our moral, our correctly, moral indignation about this. But this would have been a slave who had mobility like an unpaid secretary. So she does all of Judith's work again, but she's a slave. So I just think you should know that, because I think maid is a sanitized translation here of the Greek. And what's the message when they come to her? What does she say to them? Listen to me, rulers of Betulia. What you've said to the people today is not right. What have you done? You've put to God to the test today. You've set yourself up in the place of God in human affairs. In other words, you're pressuring God by starving yourselves and fasting to kind of manipulate God into doing a miracle for us. That is not how God works, she says. And here we have some interesting theology about how prayer does or does not impact God. You're putting the Lord to the test, but you'll never learn anything. You cannot plumb the depths of the human heart. This is kind of Hellenistic. or understand the workings of the human mind, how do you expect to search out God? So what does she say? I'll handle it. Step aside, folks. I'm going to save the people, because if you expect an outright miracle, listen up. You know how we say we're in the 21st century? Judith might have said to them, we're in the 2nd century BCE, buddy. That's a joke, because there wasn't a 2nd century BCE in the 2nd century BCE. The point is, though, her argument is we're not living in a time of miracles. We're not living in a time where God is showing God's self in these unnatural ways. So she says, I'm going to take care of things. I skipped a little bit over here, but I want to show you how Judith prepares herself. And again, if you know, you should maybe remember from our conversation last week about the image of Judah and his physical strength and impressiveness and boldness and bravery. Think about Judah as we look at the following scene. She gets dressed. And this image is both pious and titillating. Imagine it being performed on a stage, because maybe Judith was performed on a stage. This is written by someone who, yes, it's in Hebrew. Yes, the writer's Judean. Yes, the writer observed whatever it meant to observe, common Judaism at this time. But there's no question that the author is aware of novelistic strategies that Hellenistic writers were using. And so this is very theatrical, this scene. She's getting dressed. We don't need to know this, right? We could have just, we could just be told she put on a pretty dress and she made her way towards the bottom of the mountain. But the writer's having fun. And the writer wants the reader to have fun too. And again, imagine this as a play being performed. This would have been, I don't know, a little bit interesting. And yet, she's very pious. So there's nothing, you can't accuse her of any wrongdoing. Maybe you could accuse the author of some exploitation. So she removes the sackcloth. She takes off her widow's garment. She bathes her body with water. She anoints herself with precious ointment. And the details just keep going. She combs her hair. She puts on a tiara. She's very high maintenance, Judith. She dresses herself in the festive attire that she uses to wear while her husband Menashe was living. She puts sandals on her feet. She puts on her anklets. Also, she's got money. And this is a privileged woman who has the ability for many reasons to make herself, as the writer tells us, very beautiful, to entice the eyes of all the men who might see her. And we'll see that both the Jewish men and the Greek, whatever they are, Assyrian, Babylonian men, the enemy, they're all buffoons. They're all totally blinded by her beauty that they can't see what's right in front of them. So let's watch what happens. She gives her maid a skin of wine and a flask of oil, and she fills a bag with roasted grain, dried fig cakes, and fine bread. She gives this to her, I'll say, slave to carry down the mountain. Why does she need all this food? Because she keeps kosher, right? She's not going to eat the food of the enemy. So she goes to the gate, and the leaders of Betulia are in awe of her. And they're so dumbfounded that they're a little frozen. They don't even know how to stop her. But they also don't really ask her about the plan. They're just like, oh my gosh, wow. May the God of our ancestors grant you favor and fulfill your plans, that the people of Israel may glory and Jerusalem be exalted. She's like, whatever, dudes, just get out of my way. They are not challenging her because, it's easy for them to watch her put herself at risk. But the fact that there's no curiosity here, they're just like, see you later, Judith. Great job. You look good. And they go out, they let her pass again. Now remember, she's at the top of the mountain. So Betulia is a mountain, or Betulia is at the top of this mountain with the enemy at the foot of the mountain. So when she leaves the gate, she's still not she's not quite at the enemy. So she's going down the mountain. The men of the town are watching her from the top of the mountain until she goes down. She passes through a valley, and then they lose sight of her. So you can imagine this is called ogling, right? They're just staring like, and this is just lowbrow humor. I don't know that this serves any purpose except because it's kind of funny, and it also presents them as being like dolts a little bit. And then we see a mirrored reaction when she gets to the Assyrian camp. They say, who are you? To what people do you belong? And she says, I'm a daughter of the Hebrews, but I'm fleeing from them. I'm defecting from them to you because I know that they're going to be decimated by you. They're going to lose. And so I'm switching sides. Now, any sort of critical thinker would question this story because it's very flimsy, but they're like, wow, that's really convincing. So she says, I'm on my way to see Holofernes, and I'm going to show him how to capture the hill country and defeat my people. And they're like, wow. And again, it's explicit here. She was in their eyes marvelously beautiful. They say, you've seen, there's this sort of like days, like, you saved your life by hurrying down to see our Lord. Go at once to his tent. There's no security. They're not checking her bags. They're just like, see you, please go. And she marches straight into the tent of Holofernes. Now, she doesn't assassinate him right away. She takes her precious little time. So they become accustomed to her and they become comfortable with her. They're marveling at her beauty while she's making her plans. And then again, we have this sort of satirical, ridiculous humor. They say, who can despise these people who have women like this among them? It's not wise, though, to spare any of their men, because then their women will beguile the whole world. I mean, this is just like ridiculous. But she stays in the camp for 3 days, and they become accustomed to her coming and going to eat. So she's going out of the camp a few times a day to eat. She's also going out of the camp a few times a day to pray. And so they become accustomed to her mobility, and she earns their trust. But on the 4th day of this bizarre friendship, they say, all right, we have to seduce her, because if we don't, it would be a disgrace to let such a woman go. She will laugh at us if we don't seduce her. I mean, that is just like, I don't even have words. I've taught this verse many times. I literally do not have words for that strange logic. But when Holofernes, the general, says, come party with us, drink with us, Judith says, who am I to refuse the Lord? It will be a joy to me until the day of my death. And later she says, today is the greatest day of my whole life. And you can imagine like a Pollyanna kind of like, wow, today is the greatest day. I want to find, she says it twice to him. I'm not sure if I have it. Oh yeah, she does. It's right over here. So first she says, partying with you will be a joy to me until the day of my death. And then again, he says, have a drink with us. And she says, today is the greatest day of my whole life. Now, as a reader, you're laughing. This is a double entendre, like, ha, ha, ha. Why is it the greatest day of Judith's whole life? Not because she gets to party with the General Holofernes, but because she's about to kill him. So that's a delight to read. That's entertainment, folks. I mean, you're reading this as a Jew in the 1st century BC, and you're like, wow, what a clever person Judith is, that she's deceptive and yet she's able to be so convincing to the enemy. Granted, the enemy is pretty dumb. All right, let's focus on the story at hand, because I would like, if possible, to get to some of the other texts. But this is the famous scene that you might know from many, many hundreds of medieval Christian paintings and sculptures, the famous beheading of Holofernes. And you should image Google some of these incredible representations, again, from the Renaissance, from the medieval period, because this is a big favorite in sort of the Christian artistic imagination. So Holofernes passes out. He has not seduced her. He is dead drunk. And this is the moment. This is where she is ready to go. And remember the sad, unnamed servant, slave, who doesn't ever get a name in the book? She's going to be very, very important to the story. So, our hearts go out to her. Okay, so Judith utters a prayer, God of all might. And by the way, I think that this prayer, if you compare with prayers that Judah Maccabee utters in 1 Maccabees, you'll find very, very similar language. Look in this hour on the work of my hands and for the exaltation of Jerusalem. Very bizarre, because Jerusalem does not appear in the story. Jerusalem is not a player here. Jerusalem is not under attack. Betulia is under attack. The prayer is out of place, but this might be a signal to the reader, hey, by the way, maybe this isn't about a random place that never existed called Betulia. You find the real truth in the prayer of Judith. This is for the exaltation of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a real city. And that's the city that Judah is praying for when he's praying to God to help him in his fight against the enemy, the Syrian Greeks. And she says, now indeed is the time to help your heritage and carry out my design to destroy the enemies who have risen up against us. And then she takes a hold of Holofernes' hair. Give me strength today, O Lord. And she cuts off his head. Now, this is where it gets fun. Now, you might think that that's kind of the good part. The good part comes afterwards. What does she do? She's very pragmatic, Judith. Now, remember, she had that bag of food. Remember the food? She rolls his body off the bed. She pulls down the canopy from the posts and she goes out of the tent. And she gives Holofernes' head to the poor maid who puts it in the food bag. I hate teaching this class over Zoom because if I had 157 of you in person, I would do anything to see your faces of shock right now. Did you just tell me, author, that Judith cut up Holofernes' head and put it with the tuna fish and put it with the ranch dressing? That is disgusting. However, why does she pull down the canopy from the post? Because she wrapped the head in it. So she got the sheet because she's hygienic. She's not dumb, right? So she takes the head, right? She hands it with the sheet to the maid. I just love this detail. There's no purpose to this except like it's hilarious. I'm telling it to you. She wraps the head in the sheet and then puts the sheet in the food bag. And then they go back up the mountain. It's the middle of the night. So they're not discovered yet. And they go back, and then she says a sort of liturgical declaration, open the gate. Now, probably everyone's asleep. Everyone's like, shh, what's that noise? It's 3 a.m. God, our God is with us, still showing his power in Israel and his strength against our enemies as he has done today. And they hear her voice and they rush to the town and they celebrate, praise God, or praise him. Why are they praising God and not Judith? Well, that's exactly the point of the story, because God works through those who take action, right? God is not interested in those who are declaring fasts and praying and sitting around by the town gates. God does work through those who take action. And this mirrors the message of 1 Maccabees, I think, because Judah's always talking about God, but Judah's never relying on a miracle. And the valorization of the Hasmonean family lies in the fact that they attribute everything to God, but they also leave nothing to God. And so she, like Judah Maccabee, does frame this as a divine salvation. She pulls the head out of the bag and she shows it them. Remember that the slave had been carrying the bag the whole time. So she's like, give me that. And then so she gives credit to God, but she doesn't give credit to her slave. All right. And she says, see the head of Holofernes, the commander of the Syrian army, and here's the canopy beneath which he lay in his drunken stupor. The Lord has struck him down by the hand of a woman, mimicking Judges 5, where Deborah sings the song. And she says, until I, a mother of Israel, came and saved the people, there was no salvation to be seen. But again, this is a salvation that the Lord, that God has brought down to the people. They're astonished. Even the buffoon Uzziah praises Judith. And then the story ends with a shirah, a song of praise to God, just like Deborah sings in Judges 5. What's the point of all of this? And I knew that I would not get to all of our examples, but I really wanted to focus on Judith today, because I think that Judith is often misread as a historical document. And so often people say to me, was Judith a real character? Did Judith really happen? And I always say, I think you're totally missing the point. Whether there was a woman who lived in the 2nd century BCE named Judith or not is explicitly beside the point. This story wants us to think about what it means to be a servant of God. It doesn't mean to stand by and be a passive observer. Now, why all these subtleties? Why can't Judith be a man? Why can't we just write another wonderful story about Judah Maccabees, right? We have 1 Maccabees, 2 Maccabees, 3 and 4 Maccabees are about something else, but why didn't someone just write 5 Maccabees? Why do we need to do this in metaphors and allegories and hints? I think that producing a text like this at the end of the 2nd century BCE would have been considered very, very risky. To write an anti-Greek text, to write a text that celebrates rebellion against the Greek Empire in the 2nd century BC would have been risky and destabilizing. But this story gives the writer cover. Oh, you think that I hate our Greek neighbors that we finally made peace with? No, this is a story about some lady named Judith. Right, so you have some deniability, or you have some what's the phrase? Some plausible deniability here, because an explicitly pro-Hasmonean text, I think, would have been considered political and risky, and also not very theological. There's a transcendent message that's being conveyed here that I think is very timeless to the people. That's all I'm going to say about Judith, although I wonder, does it make sense if there are a few specific questions about Judith? Maybe should I take one or two now? But I'm looking and I don't see any specific questions about Judith. So we can, I'm Dr. Simkovich, not Dr. Malkovich, but many people do think that my last name is Malkovich, and John Malkovich is a great actor. But just looking at these questions. I don't see any questions about Judith. So let's keep going. Let's go to Greek Esther. Oh, wait. I was looking at all the answered ones. Oh, I do see questions now. Might Judith have been written by a woman? Very possible. Symbolism of Uzziah's name. That could be an ironic thing, right? Like he's definitely not, Uzziah comes from the words, the strength of God. And he's certainly not, he's not harnessing his own strength, and he's certainly not getting God to help him out either. Let's talk about Ruth in the Q&A because that is not immediately relevant to the book of Judith. Whereas Bethulia mentioned, you just have to read the actual book of Judith, and it's mentioned in chapters 2 through 7. Repeatedly, you'll see the phrasing references to Bethulia. You're curious about the historical relationship between the closing of the Jewish. Yeah, let's save that for the end. Wouldn't there be a lot of blood all over Judith's pretty close when she leaves the tent? No, she practiced. This was a clean cut, and she had like a really, really good knife. It was serrated. I don't know how to answer that question, but it was the middle of the night. Maybe her dress was like burgundy. Okay, so let's keep going. All right, Greek Esther. Now we're all familiar, maybe most of us are familiar with the Hebrew version of Esther. And if you are familiar with the Hebrew version of Esther, then you also know that the classic problem of Esther is that not only is there no reference to God in the story, but there's no reference to any observance of Jewish practice of any kind. So what we call common Judaism, right, the big three identifying markers of Jewish practice in the Second Temple period, Shabbat, dietary laws, circumcision, they just don't appear in the book. The biggest problem in Esther is not that God doesn't appear, and not that you don't have references to these practices. The biggest problem was mentioned to me by my professor, John Levinson. I don't know if you've read his fantastic book on Esther. John Levinson of Harvard University, one of my favorite scholars, made it very clear. The most obvious problem with the book of Esther that's in the Hebrew Bible is the ending. What's the happy ending of the book of Esther? They walk off into the sunset, intermarriage. The happy ending is that Esther remains in the palace of the Persian king, married, right? There doesn't seem to be any criticism about this resolution, as it were. Now, Jewish readers in the 2nd century BCE would have read, I'm not talking about the third Sibylline Oracle. Well, we'll talk about that later. Okay. They would have read the book of Hebrew Esther with the same questions that we have today. What is this book doing in our scriptural collection? And they sought to answer those questions in a way that made the book very pious and also very entertaining. So like Judith, the Jew who produced Greek Esther wanted to draw from Hellenistic rhetorical strategies to make the book entertaining, but frames the story in a very pietistic way. Let me just see if I included the closing signature of, I cannot believe that I didn't. I'm so annoyed that I didn't. The Greek version of Esther closes with a colophon. A colophon is very rare in early Jewish literature. It's an authorial signature. It's very precious when you get a colophon, because a colophon tells you who wrote the book. And if you look up, you can easily find this online. If you look up the colophon, C-O-L-O-P-H-O-N, the very last lines of the Greek version of Esther, you find the translator's self-identification. I'm so annoyed that I did not include this. But I wonder if I could quickly find it online. But there's a Jew named Lysimachus who gives, hold on, let me just see if I can find this, who gives his translated work to a Jew named Ptolemy, who, or I think Lysimachus is a translator and Ptolemy is the person who dispatches it with his son. There are three figures. There's a translator and there's the dispatcher and his son who bring the version, this Greek version, to the Jews of Egypt. This is very, very important. And it also says that it was produced during the reign of Cleopatra and Ptolemy, but there are three options of when that could be, because we have three different brother, sister, husband, wife, king, queen, Ptolemy, Cleopatras in the Hellenistic period. In other words, Ptolemy and Cleopatra, we have three distinct periods during which Egypt was ruled by Ptolemy and Cleopatra. So the point is that's not super helpful. But we think that this version of Esther was produced in the 70s BCE. And the colophon tells us that even though it was translated into Greek, it's not a diasporan work. It was produced in Judea, in Jerusalem, for a Greek-speaking diasporan Jewish audience, which means that the Greek version of Esther, maybe unlike the Hebrew version of Esther, is Judean. So lest you think, oh, Greek version, apocryphal, that's just some sort of liminal, marginal, peripheral, I'm just using synonyms, just sort of like this outsider, strange thing that some diasporan Jew produced. No, the Greek version of Esther was produced in the religious locus of Jewish life in the 1st century BCE, Jerusalem. And it was produced for a Greek-speaking audience who would have presumably appreciated its Hellenistic features. And so I think we need to read Greek Esther alongside Judith. And what will you find? Again, you will find a woman embodying the anxieties and the worries and the vulnerabilities of all the Jewish people. Now, unlike Judith, Greek Esther is not a stand-in for someone else, right? Esther is Esther. We consider her to be a historical figure, although we don't know when the story took place. But there's no reason to think that someone named Esther did not exist, right? I don't read this text as satirical. So the modalities are different, but the fact that we have a heroine at the center of the story and she's much more empowered than the Esther in the Hebrew book. This tells us something, that there is a comfort, there is almost a desire to see these female heroines at the center of these stories. And there's also an invitation to the Jewish readers to see themselves through these heroines. Let's take a look. But we're already getting towards the end of our time. So I'll spend about 10-15 minutes on Esther. We're not going to get to Susanna and Joseph and Asenath because I want to make sure that we have time for questions. And there are, I'm just looking right now, when was the Hebrew version of Esther? And we don't know. All I can say is let's put that the early Second Temple period under Persian rule. But we really don't know when the first version of Esther was written. So the Persian period is from 538 BC to around 323 BCE, and maybe towards, I'm not going to speculate, but I'll say more about what rabbinic tradition says about it if we have time. All right. The first thing you'll notice if you open up Greek Esther, and you can find this easily online, is that it has 6 editions that do not appear anywhere in the Hebrew version of the book. And we open up with this really Hellenistic scene. Before I talk about this scene, I want to tell you more about these 6 editions. They are kind of organized in a chiastic structure, by which I mean the first and last mirror each other. The second edition mirrors the second to last edition, and the middle 2 editions mirror each other. The first edition is the introduction to the book, and it mirrors the last edition, which is the conclusion of the book. Both of these editions are about a dream that Mordecai has. The first edition is the content of the dream. That's how the book begins. And the last edition, where the book ends, is Mordecai's interpretation of the dream. And that dream is a symbolic portending of the whole story of Esther. So we'll get to that content in a second. The second edition, which appears at the end of chapter 3. Well, actually, I think I wrote it over here. Yeah, good. At the end of chapter 3, I kind of guessed that. and the second to last edition, which is inserted after chapter 8, they mirror each other. These are the contents of the edict of the king. So the first edict says to all the provinces, you can kill the Jews on this and this date. And so this is like the contents of that edict, which we don't have in Hebrew Esther. And the second to last edition, edition E, is the content of the edict repealing the first one, or not fully repealing, but saying the Jews can fight back. They can defend themselves against the enemies, against their enemies. The middle two editions appear in the middle of Greek Esther. And these are prayers uttered by Esther and Mordechai to God for salvation. And so these editions accommodate a reader's concern that God is not in the story, because Esther and Mordechai are talking all the time about their ancestral traditions and God saving them and the promises to Israel. But they also satiate the audience's presumed thirst for entertainment. Because remember, this is a Jerusalemite text, this is a Judean text, but the translator, I think it's like Simkovich, has an Egyptian Jewish audience in mind. And these Egyptian Jews are living under a Hellenistic empire. They would have been familiar with Hellenistic literary features that we saw in 2 Maccabees last week. And so again, we have this very interesting fusion of Hellenistic stylistics and pietism. So let's start with this. Let's start with this dream. If you've ever seen a movie trailer for an action film like a Michael Bay, I don't know if you know who Michael Bay is, but like a really like testosterone-y action film. Imagine the voiceover of the movie trailer when you read this description of the dream. This is Mordecai's dream. And remember, this was probably performed many, many times, I think, by Jews in the late Second Temple period. Noises and confusion, thunders and earthquake, tumult on the earth. I also find this language to be very modern. I don't know why. This like really appeals to me as someone who lives in the 21st century. Then 2 great dragons come forward, ready to fight. We don't see any dragons, as far as I know, in the Hebrew Bible. And they roar terribly. At their roaring, every nation prepared for war. I can't read this any other way but to read it as someone who is recording an action film trailer. It was a day of darkness and gloom, of tribulation and distress, affliction and great tumult on the earth. So we're moving in and out of metaphors, right? So we're in the metaphor with the great dragons battling each other, but then we move out of the metaphor because there's a nation in distress being attacked, and the whole righteous nation is troubled. They fear the evils that threaten them, and they're ready to perish. This dream is clearly a little vignette that tells us the entire story of Esther. And this is very, very common. We actually see this also in the book of 3 Maccabees, which we're not going to look at all today. But Jews very often, when they would produce novellas, they would use this practice of opening up their novella with like a little mini, we saw it in 2 Maccabees with the invasion of the treasury, right? Didn't we see it with Holofernes, with I guess that was his name, same name as Judas' enemy general. Remember in the beginning of 2 Maccabees, we have the near invasion of the treasury, and I said that this is a vignette that will tell us the entire narrative arc of the story. It's the same exact thing here, where we have this opening vignette, the scene that tells us what to expect. And the nation cries out to God, and at their outcry, as though from a tiny spring, there came a great river with abundant water. And again, you can imagine this being performed on a stage. Light came, the sun rose, the lowly were exalted and devoured those held in honor. And Mordechai sees in this dream, like Tevye waking up from the famous dream in Fiddler on the Roof. And he sees what God is determined to do, and he has it on his mind, seeking all day to understand it in every detail. And if you go to the end, he returns to the dream. These things have come from God. Lest you read the Hebrew version of Esther and say, wait a second, is God really a part of the story? Did the writer merely write a story that has no religious content? The translator says, no, the story is all about God, right? These things came from God. I remember the dream I had concerning these themes, and none of them has failed to be fulfilled. There was the little spring that became a river. There was light and sun and abundant water. The river is Esther, whom the king married and made queen. The 2 dragons are Haman and myself. So I don't actually this is actually interesting, right? I mean, the dragons are Haman and Mordecai. Esther here is not placed at the center of the narrative, which does surprise me because she does take a central role in the rest of the book. So we can talk about that Mordecai seems to be centering himself here, Mordecai versus Haman. The nations are those that gather to destroy the name of the Jews, and my nation, this is Israel. It's like there's no mystery here. We're spelling it out for you. Who cried out to God and was saved. The Lord has saved his people. The Lord has rescued us from all those evils, etc., etc. God remembered his people and vindicated his inheritance. Now, I feel very ambivalent about Greek Esther. On the one hand, it is so fun. It is so entertaining. Even the prayers are fun. The imagery that Esther uses in her prayer for salvation, she abhors the sign of her proud position. That would be her crown. She abhors it like a filthy rag. The language is so Hellenistic. It's so fun. Why do I feel ambivalent about it? Because it lacks the charm of Hebrew Esther, by which I mean, of course, Hebrew Esther is problematic. That's what pulls the reader in. When you read Hebrew Esther, it's like a magnet drawing you into the story because you don't have it all laid out for you. You have to do mental work. You have to ask questions and then engage with the text by trying to answer those questions on your own. The translator of Hebrew Esther into Greek Esther, I think, is a little condescending towards diasporan Jews living in Egypt, saying, listen, maybe I don't trust you to figure this all out on your own. So I'm going to produce a really entertaining novella for you that will leave nothing to the imagination. Nothing will be ambiguous. It will be clear from the beginning to the end that God is in control of the people's salvation, but you'll be really entertained. And so I feel a little defensive when I read this version of Esther, like, wait a second, you couldn't trust me to figure this out on my own? But that's just my reading. And maybe you are all charmed by Esther in both of its versions. But again, we have these novellas that are featuring heroines that are expressing full piety. Yes, they're beautiful and they use their beauty to advance the interests of the people. But more than anything, they are pious, they are committed to their ancestral tradition, and they embody the vulnerability of the Jewish people. You see that in the book of Susanna as well. I don't have time to do Susanna in full. Susanna is also preserved in the Apocrypha as part of what's called the Daniel stories. We have the book of Daniel that's preserved in the Tanakh, that's in Hebrew and Aramaic. And then we have what we might call fan fiction about Daniel that was written in the late Second Temple period in Aramaic and in Greek. And all these Daniel materials, I'm trying to think of like a contemporary parallel where he was sort of a Superman figure or a Harry Potter figure, but there's all this fan fiction about Daniel that is produced for many centuries after the biblical book of Daniel is produced. And included in this huge corpus of stories about Daniel, the great hero who was devoted to his ancestral law, but beloved by the Persians, is this story of Susanna, which really is not about Susanna, it's about Daniel. Susanna is a bit of a damsel in distress in this story. She is falsely accused of adultery by some wicked elders who are angry at her when she refuses their sexual advances. And she is accused of adultery to the point where a court tries her and condemns her to death. Who shows up at the last minute, at the 11th hour, to save the day? Daniel, who goes to the court and proves that the witnesses against who have testified against Susanna are false witnesses and saves Susanna's life. The story, again, is a little different from the other texts that we've looked at because there is a focus on Daniel and his wisdom. But Susanna here too, I think, does embody the vulnerabilities of the people. And even though she is a little bit two-dimensional because she's kind of damsel in distressy, she does talk a lot. She's very loquacious. She utters prayers just like Esther does in Greek Esther, just like Judith does when she beheads Holofernes. She utters these beautiful prayers. And in these prayers, she speaks on behalf of the people of Israel. All I will say about Joseph and Asenath, which is not in the Apocrypha, is that this text was written as an imagining of the courtship between Joseph and his Egyptian wife, Osnat. Now, we know pretty much nothing about Osnat. She is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible as the daughter of a priest. And of course, the big question is a similar question that we have with regards to Moshe's marriage with Zipporah. The question is, how could this very pious patriarch Joseph have married this woman from outside the Abrahamic family, Osnat? And so we have literature produced in the late 2nd century BC that describes, I'm going to put this in air quotes, the conversion of Osnat to Judaism. Why am I putting that in air quotes? Because we have no idea what conversion to Judaism would have looked like at this early stage. It was not systematic in the way that becomes in the later rabbinic period. Conversion maybe didn't mean immersion in a mikvah. Maybe it didn't mean, studying a certain set of texts, but she does abandon her loyalty to her local gods, her local pantheon, and she accepts only the omniscience and the omnipotence of the God of Israel. And so this story, at least the first half, the second half is like almost like a separate novella, but the first half of this document recalls this transformation that Asenath undergoes. It is preserved in a collection of texts called the Pseudepigrapha. And the Pseudepigrapha is a very, very hard collection to define. The Pseudepigrapha is a modern term. It was invented in the 18th century by a German Protestant scholar named Johann Fabricius. Now, Johann Fabricius went around the world, or at least Europe, maybe North Africa, collecting ancient Jewish texts from monasteries mostly. And these texts were reproduced in medieval manuscripts. So he would go, Johann Fabricius, again, in the 18th century, would go to these monasteries and he would find 12th century manuscripts. Many of these manuscripts were originally written in the Second Temple period. Johann Fabricius collects all these documents that he thinks are really interesting and are of value to his early Christian tradition, and he publishes them in what's called the Pseudepigrapha. Now, since that time, scholars have been growing the Pseudepigrapha as we in the modern era have discovered more non-canonical texts, more texts that were not preserved in the Hebrew Bible or in the Christian or Protestant Bibles. The Pseudepigrapha has grown. So you can go onto Amazon and you can search the Old Testament Pseudepigrapha. It's with a P, P-S-E-U-D-O, epigrapha. You can search the Old Testament Pseudepigrapha and you can find modern collections that are really just disparate documents that have been discovered in modern times, produced by Jews in the Second Temple period and early Christians in the early Common Era. So the Pseudepigrapha is really almost impossible to define. But today, if you open up a modern Pseudepigrapha, you'll find Joseph and Asenath. We have many, many medieval copies of this text. There is consensus that it was produced in the late Second Temple period or maybe in the early Common Era. And so I included here, but we're not going to go into it at length, but you should all know about the Pseudepigrapha. And I think that I maybe mentioned that very briefly at the beginning of last week's class. So there you have it. I think right now I'm going to stop my share and take a look at some of your comments and some of your questions. There's a lot. So what I'm going to do is I am going to have to be selective, but I'm going to start at the beginning, and don't be insulted if I don't address your question. You can always email me, as some of you have over the past week. You can email me at msimkovich, Simkovich without a T, msimkovich@ctu.edu. Feel free to email me and I'll get back to you. So if I don't answer you now, it doesn't mean I think your question is not a good question. All right, so Bruce says, I'm curious about the historical relationship between the closing of the canon and the development of rabbinic Judaism. Was the Tanakh read and understood differently in the Hasmonean and early rabbinic periods? Bruce, I don't think you were in our class last week. I discussed this extensively. There was, I think, but you know what? I teach a lot, so it could be that I'm remembering this wrong. Maybe I discussed this with another class, but then I should have said it. There was no closed canon in the 2nd century BCE. There was no book of the Tanakh. Jews wrote their scriptural authoritative texts on scrolls. The whole notion of canon it didn't exist until the 2nd or 3rd century CE. And so there's a lot of fluidity. You have the Torah, which is agreed upon. You have the prophets agreed upon. And we know this from the New Testament in part. Jesus says, I've come not to abolish the law and the prophets, the Torah and the prophets. But the category of Ketuvim, the third category, the third section of Tanakh is open. So there is fluidity. And so what the Jews have in the 2nd century BC is they have the Torah, they have the prophets, and then there's a question of more recent books. What did they consider authoritative, and what did they not? And there was not consensus. Hold on one second. So we think that at least some Jews were reading the text of Ben Sira, which was produced in the early 2nd century BC, as authoritative, as scriptural. It doesn't end up in Ketuvim, and vice versa. Maybe not all Jews thought that Esther was scriptural. We know it's the only book of the Tanakh that does not appear in the Dead Sea Scroll Library. Every single book that ends up being canonized in the Tanakh is in the Dead Sea Caves, except for Esther. But it's open at this early stage. So that's all I'll say about that. Whereas Betuli mentioned, I already answered that later in the book. You just have to look it up. Where would you put the book of Judith in this transformation from First Temple portrayal of women as weak, adulterous, and the impact? You have to read my sister's book. Yael Ziegler wrote a wonderful book on the book of Ruth. I think the book of Ruth is very, very hard to date, and that's not my area. I think it's really smart that you intuited that could be considered a kind of transitional book. Ruth is, it doesn't really fit the mold of a Hellenistic text. I think that I have never seen any academic position that argues for Ruth being a Hellenistic book. She doesn't fit that mold of Judith or Greek Esther, so that she would be earlier, but the precise date of Judith of Ruth, I don't know. And she also doesn't fit that mold of the prophetic imagery of, the vulnerable daughter of Zion, let's say. So I think it's really interesting. There's probably a scholarship on that. But all I can say is that the book of Ruth is produced way before the text that we're looking at today. I talked about the symbolism of Uzziah's name. I think you're right to pick up on that. I think it's an ironic name. Names are very, very symbolic in early Jewish literature, so that I'm sure is of no surprise to you. I'm not going to talk so much about the third Sibylline oracle, but I will say that the Sibylline tradition, you might know, is built on this notion of, especially in the Greco-Roman world, of these female prophetic visionaries, and the third Sibylline oracle is considered to be produced by a Greek-speaking Jew in the late 1st century BC or early 1st century. And there's great scholarship on this oracle by John Collins. So I don't know what your question is, except yes, the third Sibylline oracle, there's consensus that is a Jewish text. And there's reference to the Roman occupation of Jerusalem in 63 BCE in that text. So that would be we know that has to post-date the Roman occupation of Jerusalem. So it's a little bit later. But I think it's great that you note it. I don't know if you have a question beyond that. Isn't a colophon, note 1L, in usual spelling, an indication of a book's printer or publisher, not the author? Well, look, there are, in the ancient world, the colophon would not have been, there would be no printer, there'd be no publisher, but this is the producer. And scholars like Elias Bickerman, who's written on these lines, call it the colophon. So that's what scholars call it. Maybe post-printing press, we call it, we use the term specifically with the printer. I think it's a little bit semantics that you're asking, but again, if you're looking up scholarship on those final lines in Greek Esther, you will find it mostly referred to as a colophon. What about verse 10 in the book of Esther, where it says they cried up to God and other, oh my gosh, as the questions keep coming, I keep losing my place. They cried up to God, and other parts of other chapters where it says the Jews fasted and prayed. Isn't that a reflection of their Jewishness and trust in Adonai? I don't understand the question here. I'm going to read it again. In Esther, in Greek Esther, maybe, because not in Hebrew Esther for sure, they cry out to God, and other parts where they say the Jews fasted and prayed, isn't that a reflection of their Jewishness and trust? Yes. I don't know what your trouble is with that. Yes. So please clarify, because I think I'm misunderstanding your question. Thank you, Robert. I'm very flattered, and thank you for being here. What was meant by a dragon? How did the authors perceive what a dragon was like? I have no idea, except to say that drakon, I believe, in Greek is snake. So it could have been like a giant serpent. So you are very astute to ask, right? I don't think we should imagine Game of Thrones situation here. I think it's kind of like a beast, like a giant serpent-like beast. Very good, Tammy. So Esther, but like a monster, not like a normal garden snake. It would be like, scary sort of monstrosity. Esther was never intended to be historically accurate. Well, no, I said that about Judith, but maybe Hebrew Esther was read as a historical book. Too much is there that should have been verified by archaeological evidence. Yes, I mean, look, scholars will say there's no archaeological evidence for whether Esther happened or not. All I can tell you is that the Hebrew Esther is not signaling constantly that the story didn't happen in the way that you have it in Judith. So I don't have a problem saying that Esther could be grounded on a kernel of truth. But we don't have evidence that it happened either. So am I going to make an argument from silence? No, I just can't say either way. That's all I'm going to say about it. And I'm also going to say, I don't care. I'm focused on the theological message. And I worry that modern readers put so much currency into the question of whether something happened or didn't. And I don't think that does a service to the genius of these texts. And I don't think we should say just because it didn't happen, well, let's just toss that in the garbage. I'm an Orthodox Jew living in Skokie, Illinois. I live a pretty, observant religious life. And I'm just speaking from the heart as an aside to say, maybe authorship should not be the be all of our faith, but I don't have the answer. We do not know. Did Esther happen? I don't know. Thank you, Rabbi Schimberg. I appreciate that. And I'm just going to keep going with these questions as far as I can go. And I apologize if I can't get to all of you. I think of the Daniel stories, Stuart Wald says, as predecessors of Perry Mason. I love that, right? Because it's fan fiction, kind of, right? Predecessor of Perry Mason, Susanna. Oh, I see what you're doing. Sherlock Holmes, Bell and the Dragon. It even uses a variant of the same trick from the Golden Pince-Nez. Okay. That's very interesting. I haven't watched Perry Mason recently. Maybe what Stuart is saying is you have like this detective work in Susanna. So you definitely have read the book Stuart Wald, where you have like the court scene and the detective work. And so that's like more Perry Mason like. And okay, that's great. I'm going to move on, but thank you for your comment. Okay, Melissa says, recall you remember Midrash that claims Osnat is the daughter, yes, of Dinah, who was raped. So really Jewish. That's the rabbinic attempt to include Osnat into the Abrahamic family, kind of almost an upsetting attempt. But that it's so interesting what the rabbis do with these various women, because there is this question of how could Joseph have married the daughter of a priest, of a pagan, right, of a non-Abrahamic family. Yeah, it's, the rabbis don't do this with every female outsider in the Hebrew Bible. Ruth, for example, they keep her at bay. They call her Ruth the Moabite. If you look up rabbinic midrashim about Ruth, she's the Moabite, and she's a convert who's beloved, who is lauded, and who's beloved, but also a Moabite. So Ruth has more of an outsider status. There's some wonderful scholarship on how the rabbis receive and interpret these traditions about biblical women. I'd recommend the scholarship of Tikva Freimer-Kensky. I'd recommend the scholarship of Tal Ilan, especially those two if you're interested in rabbinic developments of these stories of biblical women. What's the difference between Osnat and Asenath? Right, it's the Septuagint. It's what the Greek does to Osnat. Oh my gosh, I really lost my voice today. Would Osnat have gone through a conversion to Judaism, anything like what Ruth went through? I don't think either of them go through a systematic conversion. I would call it an internal transformation, because when we talk about conversion, there's sort of a connotation that there's something systematic happening that's ritual. We don't have evidence that there was a systematized process of ritual that would make you, go from being a Greek to a Jew. And the reason for that is because the Greeks thought syncretistically. So they resented Jews who said, oh, you're rejecting all of our gods and only loyal to our God. Why can't you just add on our gods to your God, right? They didn't perceive these various beliefs and ancestral traditions as being in conflict with one another. And I think that's part of the reason why they resented Jews who said, no, we not only embrace the covenantal God of Israel, but we're also rejecting all of your gods. But there was fluidity at this time. In other words, when we're told that Ruth joins herself to Naomi, I think we could take that at her word and not assume that she's dipping into, a mikvah or some kind of baptismal experience. That's not in the story. And I don't think that, I don't think the author intended you to intuit that. So again, no systematic conversion until the early rabbinic period, is what scholars think. How many years separated Esther from the Hebrew? So we would date Hebrew Esther to the early Second Temple period. Greek Esther was probably 76 BCE, and so you're talking many centuries, 4 or 5 centuries possibly, but Hebrew Esther is almost impossible to date precisely. All right, I'm going to go down to Robin. Do you think Judith is loaded with biblical allusions? Oh, 100% it is. I mean, all you have, forget even Judges 4 and 5, the stories of Yael and Deborah, but tons. There's no question that the writer of Judith absolutely knew. I think it is a he, because I think the way he portrays her sexuality, I think it's a he. So I'm going to say his. The writer of Judith knew his Bible and his Hebrew Bible. So there's so many just biblical allusions. It's rich. It's a very, very rich text. And so I agree with you. Tamar, Yona, I don't know about those specifically. So I'd be interested to see what you're seeing that's evoking the story of Yona for you. Please send me an email. I'd love to see where you're seeing Yona in the book of Judith. Fascinating. Is Jesus supposed to be her descendant? Yeah, look at the opening of the Gospel of Matthew. She is mentioned in the opening genealogy. And thank you so much, everybody. This was a pleasure. And feel free again to reach out. I'm simkovich@ctu.edu. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you again, Dr. Simkovich. It was a really engaging and an amazing lecture for all of us, and getting through all these questions is truly appreciated. And I personally enjoy learning about texts that most of our culture in Judaism hasn't explored deeply in recent times. So even if they're not sacred, there's so much to gain from exploring this time period in these texts. So I appreciate that, and I'm sure our audience did also. So
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure.
yes, thank